Okay, what's up YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today we're going to be talking about some homemade tanks and armored fighting vehicles of the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 through 1921. Now, the Polish-Soviet War was a conflict between the Republic of Poland and the newly formed state of the Soviet Union that lasted from 1919 until 1921. But during this conflict, both Poland and the Russian forces had designed a variety of improvised tanks and armored cars and other armored fighting vehicles for the various infantry and ground troops that were fighting one another during this conflict. So let's go over some of these vehicles. Now first, let's go over some of the Polish vehicles. Now during the Polish-Soviet War, and really towards the end of World War I, the newly formed state of Poland actually did receive armored fighting vehicles from a variety of different countries, mostly France and the UK. For example, the FT-17, which was the standard tank in the French army, was supplied to Poland in 1919, and Poland also received armored cars from the British. But the Poles also designed some of their own infantry fighting vehicles. The first vehicle actually designed in Poland was the Krasny tank. The Krasny tank was an improvised wheeled tractor tank that was designed in 1918. This vehicle had a main armament of three 7.92mm German-made Maxim MG08 machine guns. Its armor thickness was 10mm, and it had a speed of about 5 to 10 miles per hour estimate. The Krasny tank was actually the first tank designed in Poland, although it is sometimes listed as an armored car for some reason. The Krasny tank actually did serve in the Polish-Soviet War. The Krasny tank is one of the rarest Polish armored fighting vehicles of the early 20th century, and it usually isn't mentioned in any books or literature featuring Polish improvised vehicles or Polish armored vehicles in general. And the next tank on this list is the Polski-Bolszewickiej, which was a improvised wheeled armored Drazen armored car tank from 1918/1919. Now this was actually a improvised or rebuilt vehicle. This vehicle was actually made from a British-made simplex Drazen. Now a Drazen is actually a armored train car that were used by both the Allies and the Central Powers in the First World War. Now this vehicle was armed with one 37mm Skoda infantry Geschütz M15, or some other sources state that this weapon was fitted with a French-made 37mm Model 1916 TRP infantry support gun. This vehicle had an armor thickness of 5 to 10 millimeters, and the speed was relatively unknown, and it had a crew of 3 to 4. Now this vehicle again was actually constructed from a Drazen. Now a Drazen was a type of armored, or in some cases unarmored, railroad patrol vehicle that was used by the railroad industries both on the Allied and in the Central Powers front, both in the civilian and military capacity. Now, during World War I, Britain had actually given a large number of Drazens to France, but France also produced a lot of its own Drazens, and many of these ended up in Poland during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 through 1921. And you also had the Poles rebuilding of Drazens that were once used by the Russian Empire / Austria-Hungary during the First World War. They were also requisitioned by the Polish army once Poland gained its independence from those nations in the First World War at the end of World War I. And this vehicle here, the Polski-Bolszewickiej tank, was one of the rare improvised vehicles or rebuilt vehicles that was actually constructed using one of these Drazens. Now Drazens were railroad vehicles, so these vehicles were normally meant to be used on railroads, but this vehicle seems to have been redesigned for road use, and it is one of the rarer tanks or improvised tanks designed by the Polish forces or rebuilt by the Polish forces during the Polish-Soviet War. The next tank designed in Poland was actually not really a tank. It was an armored car, but for some reason it's also listed as a tank. And that is the Polsko-bolszewickiej tank from 1918-1919. Now, this was another improvised tank, and I say tank lightly because really it is an armored car. It's an armored car that was disguised as a tank-like vehicle. Now, this vehicle was designed between 1918 and 1919, and it was armed with 4 7.92 millimeter Maxim MG08 machine guns. This vehicle's armor thickness was between 5 and 10 millimeters, and it had a speed of 30 kilometers per hour or 18.6 miles per hour. Now, this was one of the, rare experimental vehicles. Only one of these vehicles were ever produced, and it was actually used during the early stages of the Polish-Soviet War. It is unknown what happened to this vehicle after 1920. I can't find any information on this vehicle past 1920, but I assume that it was most likely scrapped in the post-war era, as in the 1920s, Poland did begin to design their own infantry fighting vehicles. But this vehicle here was one of the early, armored car tanks or improvised infantry support vehicles that was used by the Republic of Poland or by Poland in the early years following World War I and during the early years of the Polish-Soviet War. Another vehicle used by the Polish military was the Ford FTB. The Ford FTB was a light armored car from 1920, and it was one of the first mass-produced vehicles to be used by the Polish military during the Polish-Soviet War. This vehicle was armed with a 7.92 millimeter Maxim, or in some cases British Vickers machine gun, and had an armor thickness of about 10 to 12 millimeters, 10 millimeters being the standard. Its speed was 50 kilometers per hour, and it had a crew of 2, a driver and a gunner. Now, the Polish Ford FTB was one of the, in terms of armored fighting vehicles, the most common vehicle was still the French F-217. But in terms of armored car, this vehicle was pretty common. At least 10 to 20 of these vehicles were built, but is considered a rare vehicle as many of the vehicles used in the Polish army came from other countries and not Poland itself. But the Polish Ford FTB is still one of the better or cheaply designed weapons or easy to mass produce weapons that were designed during the Polish-Soviet War. It reminds me of the Belgian Minerva armored car, which was an armored car used in the Belgian army during the First World War and during the post-war era. The next improvised armored car on this list is actually an improvised armored car / armored personnel carrier, and that is the Bukowski or Bukowski armored car from 1920. Now, this was an improvised armored fighting vehicle from 1920. Its main armament was 4 7.92 millimeter German-made MG08 machine guns again. This vehicle had an armor thickness of 5 to 10 millimeters, and it too had a speed of 30 kilometers per hour or 18.6 miles per hour. This vehicle wasn't just armed with machine guns, but it had a variety of different ports on both sides, and these ports were used by riflemen to target enemy troops while the vehicle was on the move. Now, this vehicle had between 30 and 40 different ports on this vehicle. That included ports on the top of the vehicle for anti-aircraft purposes. So this vehicle was pretty, well equipped for an improvised armored fighting vehicle, but it is one of the rare vehicles used in the Polish-Soviet War. Now, you might be wondering why all these vehicles have the same, speed in kilometers per hour / miles per hour, and that's largely because most of these vehicles were based on American chassis, American Model T and Ford Model A chassis. These were vehicles that were produced in the United States. These chassis were produced in the United States, and the Poles would later build improvised armored vehicles on top of them. Now, the Bukowski vehicle, only one of these vehicles was ever produced. Not much is known about this vehicle. I only found out about it recently, but it is one of the rare improvised armored vehicles / improvised armored personnel carriers used by the Polish army during the Polish-Soviet War. The next improvised armored fighting vehicle on the list is the Korfanty armored car from 1921. Now, this vehicle was designed during the last year of the Polish-Soviet War. and its main armament was 4 to 5 7.92 millimeter MG08 machine guns, but it could also use the MG15 machine gun or the MG08-15 light machine gun. Its armor thickness was between 4 and 10 millimeters, and its speed was at least 15 to 20 miles per hour. Now, this vehicle was probably one of the better of the heavy improvised armored fighting vehicles. If you look at the hull shape, it actually looks like it was fairly well designed, even though it was a vehicle from the 1920s. Now, this vehicle also had ports for small arms like handguns and rifles. It had about 4 to 8 ports for small arms located in the top half of the vehicle. Now, this vehicle also doesn't have much information on it. All I can find is a handful of photographs and the basic specifications for this vehicle. And just like all the other vehicles on this list, this vehicle seems to have disappeared after the Polish-Soviet War, meaning that it was most likely scrapped or converted back into its original form of whatever vehicle it was before the Polish-Soviet War broke out. But the Korfanty is one of the rare improvised fighting vehicles used by the Polish military during the Soviet invasion of Poland and the Polish-Soviet War. And the next tank on the list, or the next infantry fighting vehicle on the list, is the Powstaniec armored car from 1921. Now, just like the previous armored car, this was an improvised armored fighting vehicle from the last year of the Polish-Soviet War, 1921, and this vehicle was armed with 5 7.92 millimeter MG08 machine guns, but it could also use Vickers machine guns or German-made MG08-15 light machine guns. Its armor thickness was 20 to 30 millimeters and had a speed of only 12 to 30 kilometers per hour, or 10 to 18 miles per hour. Now, this vehicle was a heavy-duty infantry fighting vehicle, and it was sometimes called a tank by the Polish forces, even though it's not actually a tank. It's a heavy armored truck or / armored car. And this vehicle also doesn't have much information on it. It is just one of the improvised vehicles that was used by the Polish forces during the war. And just like all the other vehicles on this list, this vehicle seems to have disappeared in the post-war era, post-1921 and Polish-Soviet War. So this vehicle is pretty rare. I don't see much information on it. It seems that only one of these vehicles was ever constructed, but it is an interesting vehicle nonetheless. It looks like a truck version of the German A7V from World War I, except it has a turret on top for one of its 7.92 millimeter machine guns. And the next tank on this list, or the next improvised armored car on this list, is the Zabrski Powstaniec from 1921, and this was another improvised armored vehicle designed during the last year of the Polish-Soviet War, 1921. Its main armament was 6 7.92 millimeter MG08 or MG08-15 machine guns, and it had an armor thickness of only 10 to 15 millimeters. Its speed was between 12 and 30 kilometers per hour, or 18 miles per hour, just like the previous vehicle, and it had a crew of anywhere from 5 to 15. Now, this vehicle here is one of the more simpler vehicles. I mean, it looks like a armored train car if you look at it closely. This vehicle was pretty simple. Its armor thickness of 10 to 15 millimeters makes it one of the stronger vehicles in the war, as it was strong enough to withstand small arm fire. This vehicle is pretty rare. I can't find any information on it, on what happened to this vehicle post the Polish-Soviet War. Now, keep in mind, after the Polish-Soviet War and during the German invasion of Poland in 1939, a lot of these vehicles were simply melted down or destroyed during the German/Soviet occupation. Remember, both Germany and the Soviet Union annexed Poland temporarily between 1939 and 1944, although the Russians ended up being pushed out of Poland in 1941. But a lot of these vehicles were scrapped by the occupying armies during the Second World War, and a lot of these vehicles were also scrapped during the interwar years, as Poland needed metal to produce some of their own improvised fighting vehicles that were produced after the Polish-Soviet War. So that's basically it for the Polish improvised armored fighting vehicles of the Polish-Soviet War. So let's move on to the improvised Russian weapons of the Polish-Soviet War. That includes tanks, armored cars, and also half-tracks. And the first improvised armored fighting vehicle of the Polish-Soviet War was the Lenin M1, also known as the Ruski Renault tank from 1920. And this was basically just a copy of the French Renault FT-17 tank from World War I. Its main armament was either one 37mm copy of the French Pontox SA-18 gun, or it was fitted with one 7.62mm machine gun, for example, the PM Maxim 10. This weapon had an armor thickness of 8 to 22mm, and its speed was only 8 miles per hour. Now, the Ruski Renault became one of the first tanks to be designed in the Soviet Russia. Keep in mind, the Russians had already started designing tanks during World War I, and this was basically the first tank to be produced in Soviet Russia during the Polish-Soviet War.
Броня крепка, и танки наши быстрые, и наши люди мужества полны. В строю стоят советские танкисты, своей великой родины сыны. Гремя огнем, сверкая блеском стали, пойдут машины в яростный поход. Когда на бой пошлет товарищ Сталин, и первый маршал поведет. Когда на бой пошлет товарищ Сталин, и первый маршал поведет. Заводов труд и труд колхозных сажен, мы защитим страну свою страня. Ударной силой орудийных башен и быстротой динамизм огня. Гремя огнем, сверкая.
And the Russians would later go on to produce half-tracks, or improvised armored half-tracks. So let's go over some of the half-tracks that were used during the Polish-Soviet War and the Soviet Red Army. Now, during the First World War, the Russian Civil War, and World War II, the Russians actually designed a variety of different half-track based armored fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. So let's go over some of these vehicles. Now, first, we're going to start with World War I. Now, during World War I, Russia was known as the Russian Empire, and it was led by the Tsar. Now, during the First World War, Russia only developed like 2 or 3 prototype tanks, and the Russians largely relied on armored cars and armored trucks, with half of the armored cars in Russia being produced in other countries, for example, Britain, France, or the United States. But during World War I, the Russians became one of the first countries to adopt the half-track, or the armored half-track. These were half-tracks that were designed to be infantry support vehicles. And the first half-track used by the Russian Empire was the Gulkevich M1917. This was an armored half-track that was designed in 1917 and early 1917. It was designed during a time where Russia was already on the verge of civil war, but it was used on the Eastern Front against the Germans and Austro-Hungarian Empire. The vehicle was armed with one 7.62mm PM 1910 Maxim machine gun. It had an armor thickness of between 6 and 12 millimeters. Its speed was 72 kilometers per hour, or 45 miles per hour. It had a crew of 27. It had a crew of three plus 7 troops. So this armored half-track also doubled as it's kind of a infantry armored personnel carrier that was used by the Imperial Russian forces. This vehicle was later used during the Russian Civil War. Now, it's actually unknown how many of these vehicles were produced, but if I had to estimate, it was probably no more than 3 to 5. Keep in mind, during World War I, the Russians rarely mass-produced their armored fighting vehicles in bulk. They usually only produced about 5 to maybe 30 of any model of their vehicle. And when it came to vehicles like half-tracks, the Russians usually didn't produce no more than 12. Russians usually didn't produce no more than 12 of these armored infantry fighting half-tracks. Now, later on in 1917, the Russians came up with another version of the Gulkevich. This was the second version, and this was a more primitive version. The second version was also introduced in later 1917 during the early stages of the Russian Civil War. Now, this secondary version was armed with a 76.2 millimeter short gun and a rear turret, plus two 7.62 millimeter PM 1910 Maxim machine guns. This vehicle had an armor thickness of only 6.5 millimeters and a speed of 12 kilometers per hour, or 9.3 miles per hour. And it had a crew of between 2 and 6. Now, this vehicle was designed by the White Russian forces during the early stages of the Russian Civil War, but it was later captured by the Red Army. And what happened to it during the Russian Civil War is really unknown, as this vehicle wasn't well documented. Only its construction and its eventual capture was documented as taking place between 1917 and 1918. After 1918, this vehicle pretty much disappeared from the map, but it is one of the more advanced armored half-tracks designed during World War I and the early stages of the Russian Civil War. In fact, this vehicle was the first half-track to be fitted with an artillery piece instead of just a machine gun. Now, most half-tracks designed during World War I and most armored vehicles as a whole, with the exception of tanks, were fitted with machine guns, yet this half-track was fitted with a turret mounting a 76.2 millimeter short gun or short howitzer. The gun, it was actually a M1902 Pavlov model 76.2 millimeter howitzer that was being used by the Russian army, the Imperial Russian Army, and later the Soviet Army during the Russian Civil War. Now, later on in 1918, when the Russian Civil War became, a full-blown conflict, the Russian automobile designer Austin. Now, the next vehicle on the list is the Austin-Kegresse. The Austin-Kegresse was a armored infantry support half-track designed originally in 1918. Now, Austin-Kegresse was the Russian branch of the Austin automobile manufacturing plant, or automobile manufacturing company. Now, Austin was actually based in the UK, but during World War I, the British actually sent some of their plants to Russia in order to provide armored fighting vehicles for the Imperial Russian Army. Now, when the Russian Civil War broke out in 1918, many of the British employees simply fled, leaving these plants behind. So what happened is one of these plants ended up producing armored half-tracks for the White Russian Army, and these armored half-tracks were known as the Austin-Kegresse. Now, the Austin-Kegresse had a main armament of two 7.62 millimeter PM 1910 Maxim machine guns. Its armor thickness was 6 to 8 millimeters, and it had a speed of 40 kilometers per hour, or 24.8 miles per hour. It had a crew of 6, and only 12 of these armored half-tracks were ever constructed. And these were actually used by the White Russian forces from 1918 until 1919. Now, what happened is the Bolshevik Red Army, or the Soviet Army under Lenin, eventually captured most of these vehicles. Some of these vehicles ended up in Poland also. The Polish army captured at least 2 or 3 of these Austin-Kegresse half-tracks from directly from the Bolshevik Red Army, or they were handed over to the Poles by the White Russian Army, and they were later used in the Polish-Soviet War against their original owners, the Russians. Now, the Russians continued using the Austin-Kegresse into the 1920s and 30s, and there are some sources that stated that at least one of these vehicles was still in service, or at least, it was refurbished during the early stages of World War II, but that is just a rumor. For the most part, these vehicles went out of service between 1930 and 1935, but the Austin-Kegresse was pretty much one of the more advanced armored half-tracks designed by the Russians during the early stages of the Russian Civil War and during the which brings us to the next half-track designed during the Russian Civil War, and that is the Bullock-Lombard. The Bullock-Lombard was a series of armored half-tracks that were also designed between 1918 and 1919. Now, these vehicles were designed by the White Russian Army again, and these vehicles were fitted with three 7.62 millimeter PM 1910s. Some other sources state that only two machine guns, and there are other sources that state that this vehicle had four machine guns actually. Its armor thickness was between 6 and 12 millimeters. It had a speed of 72 kilometers per hour or 45 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 4, but it could also carry 7 troops. So this vehicle doubled as a armored half-track / armored personnel carrier. Now, the Bullock-Lombard was actually constructed by the White Russian government in 1918, and it became the second series of half-tracks after the Austin-Kegresse. Now, these vehicles were used against the Bolsheviks during the early stages of the war, but some of them fell into the hands of the Red Army and were used against their original owners, the White Russian forces, fighting against the Bolsheviks. Now, this vehicle, when compared to the Austin-Kegresse, this is one of the, I guess, secondary best vehicles designed by the Russians during the war in terms of half-tracks. I believe this vehicle is probably more reliable. One of the problems with the Austin-Kegresse was that it could break down real easy. You know, those vehicles actually did break down a lot. In fact, Poland captured 2 of those Austin-Kegresse because they broke down, but luckily the Poles were able to, repair those vehicles and put them back into service in the Polish army. The Bullock-Lombard didn't really have that problem as it was a cheaper vehicle, It was cheaper and it had more spare parts. It was actually built from an artillery tractor or a series of artillery tractors that were already being used by the Russian military during the latter years of World War I and by the White Russian military. It is unknown how many of these Bullock-Lombards were actually constructed, but I would estimate no more than maybe 5 to 10 maximum. These vehicles were also used during the Polish-Soviet War between 1919 and 1921. And these vehicles pretty much disappeared sometime in the late 20s. I don't see any records of the Bullock-Lombard past the year 1922/1924. So these vehicles were probably decommissioned and scrapped because they do not appear in the Second World War. Keep in mind, during World War II, a lot of these old World War I and Russian Civil War vintage vehicles were refurbished and reused by some of these civilian units within the Red Army or some of the lower ranking units within the Red Army during the Second World War, but I don't see the Bullock-Lombard anywhere in the Soviet inventory during the Second World War era, which pretty much means these vehicles were probably scrapped or destroyed during the Polish-Soviet War, or were probably just decommissioned or destroyed again during the Russian Civil War, because the Russian Civil War didn't end until 1923. So these vehicles basically disappeared in the 1920s, and that basically ends the information on the Bullock-Lombard. Another half-track designed by the Soviets was designed by the end, at the very end of the Russian Civil War. And this was in 1923, and this was the Krasny Petersburg model of half-track. And only a handful of these were produced, only like 2 to 4 maximum. And these vehicles were improvised armored half-tracks or cheaply made armored half-tracks from 1923. These vehicles had one 7.62 millimeter PM M1910 Maxim machine gun. The armor thickness was again between 6 and 12 millimeters. It had a speed of 27 kilometers per hour, and it had a crew of 3 plus 7. It could carry 7 troops in the rear area. Now, this vehicle is very similar to the first half-track I showed you on the list, and it's basically a simplified version, or at least it was probably inspired by it. This vehicle is really, really rare. I can't find much information on it. All I know is that it was produced by the Red Army. So I guess this is one of the first Red Army made half-tracks designed towards the very, very end of the Russian Civil War during the last year of the Civil War in Russia in 1923. Again, just like the Bullock-Lombard, this vehicle does not reappear after the Russian Civil War. I don't see it in the list of vehicles, of antiquated vehicles that were used by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, which leads me to believe that the vehicle was probably scrapped sometime after the Civil War, maybe in the late 1920s or probably in the 30s, like a lot of these older vehicles. And that's basically it. There's not much on the Krasny Petersburg half-track, other than the fact that it was produced by the Soviet Red Army in limited numbers. So what do you think of all of these weapons? Which of these improvised weapons from either the Polish or Russian armies did you like the most? If I had to pick, my favorite of the Polish vehicles is the Komarowem tank, and my favorite of the Russian vehicles are the Austin-Kegresse and the Gulkevich M1917. And so that's basically it. So what do you all think of these weapons? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.